Thank you so much. First of all, it's a pleasure to have this opportunity to share experiences and learn from one another as regards the way forward in managing and dealing with non-tariff measures. Excellency Minister, distinguished guests, business community, and everyone here. I'm here to give a very brief overview of what the government's perspective on non-tariff measures. And then on the other side, I'm also going to look at what actually the private sector thinks of ATMs. And then eventually I look at what may have caused the difference in opinion and understanding of NTMs and how we can bridge this together. I'll also share with you a handful of things that we have tested and proven to have worked in dealing with NTMs in Rwanda, as well as the results that we got from that. So starting, first of all, the private sector, definitely they'll tell you the usual things. If you ask them why they have all the ATMs around, the first thing they'll tell you is that they have to protect government interests, which is true. They have to ensure taxes are collected. They have to ensure there's no illicit trade. They have to ensure the economic path is in line with the National Economic Development Program and so on. They'll also tell you they're doing that for consumer protection. They tell you they're doing that for environmental protection. And then another thing that they'll tell you that the private sector does not agree with is they'll tell you they're supporting and facilitating the private sector to better do their businesses. That is from one side. Now, on the private sector side, you ask them the same thing, they'll tell you something that sounds like this. First, they'll tell you that's another trade barrier and unnecessary additional cost to doing business. They'll tell you that it is full of very many unnecessary red tape and bureaucratic procedures that are only going to delay us and give us more constraints, both via time and resources, which is money. They'll also tell you that for them, they think NTMs is all about the policymakers' interests. It has nothing to do with serving their interest. So that brings us to the question, why is it that they look at it in different ways? Why is the gap there? What has to be done to bridge this gap and people look at it in the same way? After all, at the end of it, it's going to be a benefit for both of them. It's a win-win situation, as I'll explain later. So, looking at Rwanda's case and in the regional context, we looked at so many things through surveys and studies and interviews and so on, and then realized there are a number of things that should be done to bridge the gap between, the communication gap between the public and the private sector. And number one, which all of you can guess, is of course public-private partnership. With this, what we realize is that every policy that, that interests or has something to do with the business community, be it in importation, exportation, and even others, but for now I'll focus on imports and exports. If you ask them, most of the policies are like a one-way approach. Like the government side produces policies, and they'll tell you they have consulted and they have investigated and have done research, and then they'll put the policy in place, and the private sector is not involved. So one thing that we put in place is the involvement of the private sector from the policy formulation, from the beginning. And this was done in a number of ways. Number one, for example, every time the cabinet is going to sit before passing a law that is relevant to trade, to exports and imports, there is always what they call a pre-cabinet. And in the pre-cabinet, the private sector looks at whatever is going to be proposed to the cabinet and gives its inputs, and it's considered before it actually passes. The second thing is to add another perspective, to the policies that affect the business community. It shouldn't be only to do with ensuring compliance. It shouldn't be imposed. It shouldn't be like, it shouldn't be like a policing aspect, but rather there should be some component of facilitation. Because for the private sector to respond and comply, number one, it has to seem to be facilitating them in what they are doing. Otherwise, anything that comes like it's an imposing or it's an enforcement usually will not get their required compliance. For example, if you look at Rwanda's case, government institutions like the Rwanda Development Board, which is in charge of promoting trade in general, investments, exports, and so on, they have something that they call they have information centers. That is where every member who wants to get any facilitation from the private sector for exports can go and be guided on the requirements of the markets they intend to export to, on the certification and licenses that they need, on the, the prices of the commodities in the markets that they are targeting, and so on. So once they give them that service, and then at the end of the day, on the other side come and tell them, but we have done for you this, but you need to do this for us because we have this kind of interest that we expect to get from it. That inclusivity, that inclusiveness of the private sector makes them own the process and comply. And once they own the process, definitely they give you feedback on how to make it better. The other element is capacity building. We realize that, first of all, at the policy level, the people who formulate the policies, there's a big communication within themselves. The policy is passed, but the guys who are implementing at the ground level, the office, the front desk people who are supposed to be facilitating you, do not know actually what has been changed at the top. So you realize, you go to someone and you tell them, the new rule for cost of origin for East African products is this and this and this. And they'll tell you no. And they'll show you probably the documents that were for last year that is going by. So there is internal miscommunication within themselves sometimes. The other thing is, of course, institutional strengthening, equipment, laboratories, and so forth and so forth. The other thing that we also looked at as worth exploring was, applying technology where necessary. So we had the electronic single window that is ongoing. We had online business registration. We had, a number of technologies. We had the international trade point network that we joined, and all information centers that are IT based. And all these centers facilitated not only the process of accessing markets and learning more about the processes and regulations that they need to have in place to export or import, but it actually also facilitates them. So if you can apply, if you can register your business online, that's going to save you time. It's going to save you, the transport, for example, that's going to take you to the offices, and probably they'll tell you to come back and so on. So with all this technology usage, we have seen a very big improvement in NTM's management in general. The other thing is people don't, it's the private sector, the lower ones, they don't really have any, they don't understand the concepts that policies are formulated. So apart from formulating a policy and putting it in place, whereby a few maybe private sector members who are on boards or who are welcomed to a function to explain to them the new policies, those will know. But at the grassroots, we realized there was no mechanism for people to understand, for people to know as something as simple as, by now, you can export your products to the region. So there's no dissemination, sufficient dissemination of information. People are not sensitized, and that comes back to one thing. If they do not understand what you're telling them, they will not buy in. So for them to buy in, they need to understand it. You can't just impose on them and expect them to do that. The other thing is we realized we needed to do, we needed to have some facts to base on. So we did a number of researches that was alluded to by the moderator. We had the non-tariff barriers studies, 2 of them. We had the cost of doing red tape. And by the way, that cost, the study on cutting the cost of doing of red tape to promote business growth in Rwanda. When the results came out, initially we presented it to government and they're like, no, that can't be true. Maybe I won't go into the details of the figures, but we showed it to them as a percentage of GDP. How much money is lost in red tape? What is the cost of telling someone come back tomorrow? What is the cost of someone waiting in the office for 2 hours? We tried to quantify all that and put it in figures, and then we said, this is what we're losing. And first, they did not want to accept it, but that was when I was in the private sector, and eventually when we invited the people who had done the study for us, who had commissioned it, and they presented, and then they raised the red flag and said, this has to stop, we have to stop this. So evidence-based arguments and, and papers should be presented. However, besides that, the government also tells you the private sector has something that they need to do. They said the private sector, if they show a level of maturity where they can comply, if we can build confidence in them, things will be much easier. For example, the private sector, like I told you, a few of them met and they told the policymakers, we need the border to be open 24 hours. We need, Rwanda Revenue Authority to open branches for people to pay, in different places and so on. And they said, yes, we'll do that. We need Rwanda Revenue Authority to open on Saturday and Sunday because, there's queuing and so on. And the government says, okay, that's okay. You want that? We're going to do that for you. But that's to the small people. So they did that. And when they did that, they realized one thing. They are queues from morning until sunset. But as soon as the sun sets, no one comes to the border. And those are expenses, and the borders are open. And they said, the private sector said they wanted this, but here it is, and they're not here. Revenue Authority is saying we employed extra staff to work on Saturdays and Sundays. But you all disappear on Monday morning, you all come on a queue. So the private sector has to play its role also. At least in our case, that's what we were thinking at that time. And then, of course, there's an element that I will not dwell on of the international aspect. You know, a landlocked country like Rwanda and others, where you have to depend on export routes through other countries. Sometimes you go through a number of non-tariff barriers, but that is for another day and another case. So, to conclude, I'm going to tell you a number of things that we did in response to what we had identified as the problems. One of the things we did is we tried to pull together, services and put them in one-stop centers. That reduced the number of days, the cost on the side of the people that are doing it, and then the simplification of the whole process. The other thing is that we reviewed a number of requirements, and we removed some that were unnecessary, and those that seemed to be identical or similar, we put them together. So we reduced the steps and requirements substantially, and that, of course, reduced the process of managing them and also the time and resources involved. The other one is that we keep having kind of feedback from the private sector. We have, for example, what we call TIF and KIF. TIF is Tax Issues Forum. KIF is Kigali City Investors Forum. That is where we meet. We used to meet on a quarterly basis and review tax laws, tax processes, review environmental processes, review all the different things that we think the private sector can raise. So things have to keep changing. But one thing that I'll maybe one thing that I'll conclude on in the interest of time is that the only solution that seemed for our case probably for many other countries is that the private sector had to own the process, had to be involved, had to be consulted, and had to be facilitated. Because at the end of the day, the results, which I'm concluding on, are significant. You realize that once all these NTMs are addressed properly with the input of the private sector, in Rwanda's case, at least we have seen the following. Number one, the rate of compliance increased significantly. The rate of whether in taxation, whether in meeting requirements, whether in everything, it increased substantially. Secondly, there was an automatic increase in exports and trade in general, because people are being facilitated to meet the market, to meet the demand, to meet the requirements. And because they made that and they're being facilitated, their products were more accessible to the market. The other thing is it also promotes foreign direct investments, because Rwanda is a small country with a small market. So most of the people that come and invest in Rwanda look at exporting in the region. So if re-exporting from Rwanda is good, then definitely they're going to come and set best in Rwanda, which is what they did. The other thing is value addition, because of the requirements and standards that are set. By being obliged to meet the requirements and standards, automatically there's a value addition. So they're even getting better prices for their products. They're producing specialty coffee, they're producing things that are giving them more returns, but from the same resources that they have, like land. And then finally, we're also seeing Rwanda's export sector being competitive in the regional context and globally, and thanks to the approach that we used in unifying the private and public sector towards NTMs and export promotion. So with that, I thank you so much. I hope I made the time.
Thank you very much, Mr. Murenzi.